Hi, everyone. It's Jeremy Adelman from Princeton, New Jersey. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So I'm going to break this video into 4 parts because I'm having difficulties uploading. So I'm going to go question by question. And the first question is about how the epidemic is being experienced now in the United States. And that's a very challenging question because the United States is so large and so heterogeneous that the experience varies depending on your location. In some areas of the country, like New Jersey, where I'm living now, the pandemic hit extremely hard. And it was very niched, very focused on certain sectors, particularly in homes for the elderly, but also prisons. And it's also struck very hard for communities, particularly minority communities, that already faced public health challenges. In other parts of the country, the pandemic has not hit very hard yet. And that partly explains for the reasons why social movements and the government has responded in such diverse ways to the crisis. So it's been very mixed. Some areas hard hit, like New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and who are now in the recovery. Although even then, the recovery has been also very differentiated. So some have now, after a very hard hit, like New York, the curve, as it were, has improved. But others, like New Jersey, it's been very, very stubborn for reasons we're still trying to understand. So if you ask about the United States, I would say it really, really depends on where you are and who you are to explain the impact of the pandemic. The second question is about the social, economic, and political situation in the United States. And again, just as in the first video, I talked about the heterogeneity of the country, here too, it really depends where you are. Although it is worth saying, just to start with the politics, that at the very top, within Washington, the federal government response has been, for some people, seen as dramatically inadequate and in calculated ways incompetent. And there's a lot of disagreement about what has explained the ways in which the Trump administration has responded to the crisis in such a feckless and some would say irresponsible way. But at the local level, at the level of states and of municipalities, again, there's been enormous variety. Some states responded to the crisis by taking it seriously and locking down. Others have been much more, as we would say, laissez-faire and allowed people to go around their business. So it really varies a great deal. What I can say is that the economy suffered tremendously around the country. We have a very high unemployment rate, and that's now turning into a social crisis because so much of basic health insurance was tied to people's employment. So there's a lot of questioning now about the state of the economy and people's access to basic care. On a social level, I think there's a lot of personal anxiety about plans for the future. People who have young children are worried about their summer camps and schools. So again, it depends on your personal circumstances. And I would say politically, it's only aggravated the polarization that has been plaguing this country now for a very long time. The third question is about the reaction and the responses in the United States. And my first 2 videos, I've emphasized the importance of the heterogeneity and the variety of American experiences. Here I would say that the response of the government and all the way down to families has reflected something that's been going on in this country for a very long time, which is that the country has responded in highly polarized and in discrepant ways. In fact, many people are starting to wonder just how much and whether there is one single country here at stake. Why this pandemic did not yield to, and this is something perhaps we should discuss, a sense of integration and unification of common cause and purpose in the struggle against the pandemic. It's produced exactly the opposite. a high degree of polarization. It's worsened the divide in the country than we had before. The other response has been localization, that in the absence of a central authority and anything that is integrative has pushed back the authority and the response to local level administrators. And to some extent, at least speaking from my own experience, the response has been quite competent. The difficulty is, of course, that local authorities are really reduced in their capacity to gain access to the resources that only the federal government has can marshal. That ranges from personal protective equipment and ventilators all the way through to money. And there's an enormous local now desperation for access to these resources. And the last component, I would say, was the lag in the response. Despite all the early indicators from China and from the experiences in Italy, the United States was very, very slow to respond. And when it did respond, it responded by shutting borders. This is the Trump way. Rather than mobilizing the kinds of resources that many people were arguing were necessary, like ventilators, testing capacities, and the testing continues to be a sore point in this country's ability to respond and to get ahead of the pandemic. So I would say the reaction tells you a story about the nature of central government and national unification in the United States. The final question is about how I see in a sense, the post-coronavirus world. And I would point to three issues that concern me. The first is the state of U.S. leadership. If there was ever a thought that the United States was a moral, economic, legal leader in world affairs, I think the effect of the pandemic has shown that there is now a gap between that expectation, whether you were in favor of it or not, and certain realities, and that what we're witnessing is in a sense, a dramatic and accelerated way, the withdrawal of the United States from leadership of world affairs. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, and that concerns me a great deal about the future, is the rise of suspicion and the fear of distant countries and powers, and an anxiety, one might say, about sovereignty. That we can't trust foreigners and foreign powers when it comes to our basic welfare. Some of this is being directed, of course, against China for its a sense of failing to step up to its responsibilities to warn people. But some of it is being directed at international institutions that we had an enormous amount of faith in, like the World Health Organization. And just as we need international institutions now for solving common world problems, my concern is that there's a lot of suspicion and questioning the legitimacy of some of those very needed institutions. And getting through these crises, we need them. So that's number two. And then number three, and it's perhaps the most concerning of all for me, is what's going to happen in the developing world, where the basic infrastructures for dealing with what will start out as a public health crisis and will turn into a dramatic social and economic crisis if nothing is done. Where the capacity for local societies to adapt to resist, to withstand the threats of the coronavirus may lead to widespread starvation, the spread of other kinds of diseases, and quite possibly the worst humanitarian crisis that the planet has ever seen. And that really concerns me.